Welcome to the Lean to the Left podcast, where we pulled no punches in calling out Donald Trump and his MAGA supporters for attacking our democracy. In late 2019, during Trump's impeachment investigation, there were numerous reports of influence peddling by his personal attorney, Rudy Giuliani, and his associates, Lev Parnas and Igor Fruman. In his book, The Persuasion Game, author Chad Lewis, our guest today, reveals details of those influence schemes those clowns conducted, hoping to enrich themselves. Gradually, Giuliani and Parnas's corrupt schemes spread and entangled officials at the highest positions of Trump's administration, eroding American institutions. The persuasion game connects the dots and should be important to anyone concerned about the future of American democracy. The book details the untold corruption of the first Trump administration that may have directly led to Donald Trump and Rudy Giuliani attempting to overturn the 2020 election results. Chad, thanks so much for joining us on the Lean to the Left podcast. I really appreciate it and look forward to you sharing some of the details about this investigation that you did that led to the book.
Bob, thanks for having me on. I appreciate you having me on.
Yeah, buddy. Hey, we're in unprecedented times now as Trump works to enrich himself and his billionaire friends while threatening democracy and directly harming even his own MAGA supporters through deep budget cuts and his tariff game. What are your thoughts about all of that, Chad?
Oh, it makes me a little bit nervous because the world's a little chaotic now across the world. And then Trump is adding a little more fire to the fever that's happening around the world in terms of Middle East conflict as well as conflict in Ukraine. So adding on a tariff war makes me think back to the 1930s, where the United States had implemented across the board tariffs getting out of the Great Depression.
Yeah.
And in doing so, exacerbated the ongoing depression that was happening globally. And that in time would lead indirectly to World War II.
What do you make of Trump's continued cozying up to Putin?
It's a little confusing for a lot of people. What I see is Trump admires an authoritarian leader because he wants to have those same powers, if you will. But what is frustrating to me is these are obvious no-brainers about how the United States should act and interact with its friends and allies vis-a-vis its adversaries. And it seems like Trump consistently decides to take an adversary's point of view when it comes to Russia.
So, what are the implications of all of that for the U.S. and the rest of the world?
When you look at the U.S. ally relationships, in the past, the United States tries to build up its allies and use the soft power of both the United States and its allies to press forward democracy in the world. But now what we're seeing is the United States pushing away from its allies and closer towards its adversaries. So now it's leaving our allies, for example, in Europe or in Asia, wondering whether or not they need to, for example, procure their own nuclear weapons as opposed to being under the U.S. shield that it has been for many decades.
You spent over a decade abroad, Chad, living in Europe, Russia, and South America. What did you observe about Putin's disinformation effort in the United States?
That dates back to 2014 when Russia first invaded Ukraine after what was referred to as the Maidan Revolution. Essentially, what Russia did is see the Ukrainian government under a Russian puppet collapse, and that puppet fled back to Russia. And immediately afterwards, Russia invaded the countries. As I was first looking into building a business in Russia, because I had just come from Russia, I was paying attention to everything that was going on vis-a-vis Russia, Ukraine, Russia, NATO, Russia, Europe, and the United States. And I started seeing, I remember this very succinctly, there's a newspaper called the Moscow Times, an English newspaper that focused on US-Russian relations. And in those articles on the Moscow Times, you would see something like, oh, I don't know, 7 or 8 comments on a general article, most of them expats who have some familiarity with Russia. Suddenly, in February of 2014, I was seeing hundreds of comments going on. And the vast majority of them, maybe 80, 85%, were pro-Russian and were clearly taking a strategy from a playbook in which they tried to insinuate that somehow the United States backed the revolution, somehow that the United States is fighting the Russians in Ukraine, that the government in Ukraine is a fascist government, none of which comported to my knowledge. And for my background, I have a degree in history, degree in political science, both of them focused on Europe and Russia. So I would be aware of major transgressions in Ukrainian political behavior. So what I was witnessing was the birth of Russian disinformation. But the beauty for me was I had just come from Russia and I had taught English there. So I was familiar with Russian grammar mistakes in English, which made it very easy for me to pick out Joe from Wisconsin that was making Russian grammar mistakes, talking about Russian foreign policy. That happened in February 2014, we'll say the flickering on of Russian disinformation. And since that time, it's continued on to the present day. And it's now globalized and localized, meaning globalized, it's not just about Ukraine. Now it's individual countries. And it's localized, whether it be in Ukraine or in France or in Germany or in Great Britain, the United States, Italy, Greece, you name it, all across Europe. That's even expanded into Africa. But what I find sad is that in 2014, I reached out to a congressman and sat down with an assistant for 2 hours and tried to explain to them that the Russian disinformation operations was happening. The unfortunate thing is, after a 2 hour conversation, they just put up their shoulders and said, yeah, what can we do? And I said, you need to alert the American public. They decided not to. And lo and behold, 2 years later, Russia's disinformation continued to the effect of helping to elect Donald Trump.
Do you feel like the mainstream media had anything to do with this?
In what sense? You mean?
Did they perpetuate the disinformation that Russia was spreading in the United States?
I think the American media, or for that matter, European or global media, was unaware of what was happening.
Uh-huh.
And just because you can broadcast something and look like you're very familiar with the world and history and politics, doesn't mean you actually can see it in real time when something has changed. And so I think they were very unaware that there was an industrial scale effort to pump disinformation into the lifeblood of democratic societies. So, because they're unaware of it, they allowed some of it to happen across media platforms such as Facebook, such as Twitter. But it also happened, for example, on CNN. You may not remember this, but only, I don't know, maybe 7 or 8 years ago, you could see an article on CNN that would have comment sections down below. They got rid of those comment sections because they were infested by Russian disinformation. Same thing happened on Fox News. They used to have this or comment sections down below on most of their articles.
Interesting.
And when it came related to Russia, Ukraine stuff, those comment articles disappeared.
No kidding. I didn't know that.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
it's interesting.
But a true story, I tried to warn the US government way ahead of time so that hopefully they would be able to stop the shaping of Russian disinformation by the Russian government. But I reached out back again to the US government in the summer of 2016 and explained that I was seeing a grand enlargement of Russian disinformation, something that I had seen just before when it comes to Brexit in Great Britain in 2016, and said, we have a problem. And I met again with a congressional aide in what was it, in January of 2017, trying to explain to them, you have a problem, you need to let the American people know that there's a Russian disinformation operation ongoing and to be aware of it just so that it could be in part at least countered. But the problem is by 2016, you had what I refer to as an anchor of reality change for a lot of people, i.e., if I pump disinformation to you and I create a worldview for you, then it's hard for you to walk away from that worldview once it's established in your mind. So that you had many people that thought, oh, well, Russia is innocent. They would never do such a thing. Oh, Russia is fighting fascists against the world. Oh, they're trying to promote democracy. When the truth is, Russia is far from a democratic country. It's far from a religious country. Atheism is all across the country, and that the Russian government itself is trying to sponsor this concept of Russia as a hero of Christendom and a hero of Western culture. And the reality is quite the opposite.
All right. So I'm curious to know what you think about what's going on today in the United States and how that might relate to what's happened in the past with autocracies. Germany and Hitler, for example. I'm just wondering what you think about that.
Yeah, I would go away from the Germany and Hitler, and because the way Hitler came to power, it was in part a democracy. Germany was a democracy in the 1930s. I believe 32 is when Hitler first came to power as chancellor. But then he had what was known as the Night of the Long Knives, that was preceded by Kristallnacht, the fires that attacked the German parliamentary building. And he used that as a way of creating martial law in the country, getting rid of communists, getting rid of organizers, getting rid of democratic speakers, and imprisoning them in concentration camps. What I would look to today, that's a better comparison to what authoritarian pushes that Trump is trying to make, is something closer to Turkey, as an example, which I spend, I don't know, a good third of my book probably focusing on. And in that, Turkey was a democracy in 2014. Mind you, it had its ups and downs as a democracy through time, but it was nevertheless a democracy, and people would be elected. The media was relatively free, et cetera, et cetera. In 2014, Turkey started to change. And what started that change, as I also lay out in the book, is investigations by Turkish police into a bribery, corruption, money laundering scandal that was happening, that went all the way from the money launderer who was laundering $20 billion plus through Turkish banks and into Iran for the benefit of the Iranian government. And he tried to get his way out of the criminal investigations in Turkey, that is the money launderer. And what he did is he bribed Turkish officials to get out of that. And in doing that, he also helped shut down the investigations in Turkey. And in the end, Erdogan, the president of Turkey, both then and today, he ended up firing the police, firing the judges, firing the prosecutors who were investigating this case and shutting it down. That led to a general repression of investigations against the party officials in the Turkish government. And down the line, it led to major attacks on Turkish government institutions, i.e., tens of thousands of people were fired from their jobs, tens of thousands of educators or civil servants or military officers, et cetera, et cetera. And essentially, what the Turkish government did under that is they installed loyalists across the system. By 2019, Turkey put more journalists in prison than any other country around the world. And it's a little known secret, but Turkey turned to an autocratic country because the president of Turkey was being directly accused of money laundering. And that president decided that, hey, as opposed to facing those charges, I'm going to suppress any energy for civil society to be able to fight and stop the corruption from happening in the government. In turn, the president of Turkey then put the government under martial law for between 2016 and 2018. And during martial law, he changed the constitution. And so what I would do is look towards the Turkish government as a modern version of an authoritarian government that the United States under Trump is starting to follow. In the
All
United
of that
States,
sounds, yeah, all of that sounds eerily familiar to what's going on today.
yeah, yeah. In Turkey, they went after journalists.
Mhm.
Either they pressed on the media platforms to follow the government line, or they would arrest the journalists. Here in the United States, you have CBS, ABC, Washington Post, New York Times, NPR. All of them are under attack by the U.S. government,
Yeah,
and it's an eerie reflection of what I had seen abroad.
really, absolutely. So, do you think that America is on its way to becoming an autocracy?
I think if the people don't stand up, it will walk right past them, i.e., the authoritarianism. And people need to be aware that an example, when the president is trying to press to get rid of habeas corpus for immigrants, you
Yeah,
don't just get rid of habeas corpus for immigrants, you get rid of habeas corpus for everyone.
yeah,
And habeas corpus is the foundation of the rule of law. So if you decide to get rid of the concepts of habeas corpus, it means that you don't get a lawyer to help adjudicate whether or not you're a criminal. You don't get a lawyer to adjudicate whether or not you belong in the United States or not. The government can make a declaration and then just send you out or put you in prison. And when you go down that road, you will not get it back, not without a fight. So to answer your question, yeah, I worry a great deal.
Okay. So tell me how your book deals with these issues, Chad.
Oh, at a macro level in my book, I focus on Turkey, Venezuela, Russia, and their intermediaries and their neighbors, and how those countries and their leaders sought to find favor with the US government, and they would do it in clandestine manners. So the book zooms in on those enablers that help those governments try to push their interests into the US government. The book pays a particular attention to Rudy Giuliani and his former associate Lev Parnas and how they became power brokers behind the scenes and how that led to Trump's first impeachment. In the case of the money laundering scheme that I had mentioned earlier, Giuliani was the lawyer for the money launderer, only he wasn't going to a court of law to press the case of the money launderer's innocence.
Yeah.
He was taking it to the White House and seeking political deals so that the money launderer would be traded back to Turkey and that the prosecutions of the money laundering would disappear because the Turkish government was concerned that it would lead directly to the leadership of the Turkish government.
So you feel like we're in deep shit trouble.
That is certainly a way of putting it. What I worry about is that Trump, who had been indicted prior to him running for, I'm sorry, had been indicted prior to him succeeding in the 2024 election. He has so much corruption behind him, which I lay out in the book in great detail, to the point of 3,300 endnotes to the book, just to give you a concept of how deep the bibliography is. It's roughly half the book size.
Wow.
That they had been corrupt before, and that corruption led to obstruction of justice in the United States. And as I had talked to you in a pre-interview conversation, that I believe that corruption may have actually led to, or the corruption and the obstruction of the investigations of that corruption, which started in 2019, that they have actually led to the attempts to overturn the election in 2020. To put it in a shorter hand for you, because Trump and Giuliani were under pressure from investigations of Giuliani acting as a foreign agent, that they tried to block those investigations. And those investigations were being run by the lead prosecutor at the Southern District of New York, a guy by the name of Jeffrey Berman. Berman was fired abruptly in June of 2020. This is in the middle of COVID, and after maybe 4 months after Trump was not convicted of his charges of trying to extort the Turkish, or I'm sorry, the Ukrainian government. And Berman just suddenly was told, hey, can you move to a different position in the US government? And Berman's response to then AG Barr was to, hey, if you want to fire me, do it right. Don't try to put somebody just in to my position. And the reality was Berman thought that he was being essentially fired for prosecuting either Halkbank, the Turkish bank that was doing the money laundering, or Giuliani and Lev Parnas, which Trump had direct connections to. I think the reality is something different. I think it was the intermeshing of the investigations of Halkbank and Rudy Giuliani and Lev Parnas acting as, we'll say, mob lawyers trying to secretly make a deal for these individuals that led to the 2019 impeachment. And that 2019 impeachment and leads to Berman being fired, and Trump trying to put someone in his place. For me, in my opinion, to slow down the investigations, because if the investigations came out before Donald Trump was reelected in 2020, he'd have no chance. Besides that, his polls were already bad between COVID and the economic ruin that came with COVID. So I think that Trump and Giuliani were trying to win at all costs to the 2020 election. And when they ran into the loss of the 2020 election, they ultimately decided to scheme a way to stay in power anyway, because they had to. Otherwise, they wouldn't be able to freeze the prosecutions or investigations. And that could lead to Donald Trump going to prison. It's the question that no one asks is, why would you risk it all to overturn the election if there's nothing else there on the table? And the answer is in my book.
Okay, so there's material in your book that has not been published before, that's new, that's fresh, that
All
people,
very new.
huh?
All very new. Yes. It
All
only came
very
out
new.
on Hardback came out on April 2nd.
Okay, excellent. Now, all right, so why did you decide to write it to start with? It was a huge undertaking, right?
Oh, it was 4.5 years of grueling work.
Wow.
I cannot underline the term grueling enough.
Okay.
So in September 2020, I read an article that brought together the Ukrainian American Lev Parnas that was acting as an associate of Rudy Giuliani. And that Parnas was meeting Turkish oligarchs with deep connections to President Erdogan in Turkey in his inner circle.
Mm.
The article that I read pointed to a meeting in Kiev, Ukraine, by Lev Parnas and his associate Igor Fruman. And this meeting took place in December of 2016, just after Trump got elected and was as the Trump administration was transitioning to take over the government in 2017. And at that point, I had already known that about Parnas and Giuliani and Igor Fruman as it relates to Turkey and trying to extort the incoming president Vladimir Zelensky. And I also had read a number of articles about Parnas and Giuliani being involved in secret talks with Venezuela, things that were not connected to the US government, but that apparently Giuliani and Parnas and others were working on the side. And so between the knowledge that I had before, this article really caught my interest because here you have Lev Parnas and his friend Igor Fruman, who both appear in the Trump impeachment one, talking to Turkish oligarchs and seeking introductions to Washington lobbyists. And at that point, I was just like, that's really interesting. Why would they be involved with anything to do with Turkey? Because I know them about Ukraine and Venezuela. And then it came to me that what I found in a few short hours of research is Rudy Giuliani also had ties to Turkish lobbying efforts at the same time that Parnas did. And more importantly, that those efforts were all centered around the $20 billion bribery money laundering case that I discussed with you earlier. And what I also uncovered was apparently subtle attempts of the President of the United States to block the prosecution of this bank and individuals connected to this bank, Hawk Bank, from going forward. And so based on the initial evidence, I suspect that Giuliani had persuaded his friend, Donald Trump, to intervene, and that Parnas may have been working with Giuliani back in 2017 towards the same goal, just like they had worked together with a Venezuelan secret project in 2018 and Ukraine in 2019. So to get to the bottom of all of this, I recruited a journalist who would go on to interview Trump's former Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, and Trump's former National Security Advisor, John Bolton. And that interview was published just a few days after the attack on the Capitol building in 2021. I think it came out in January 9th of 2020. While you were seeing what had happened to the Capitol building and were aghast, I was just waiting for an article to come out that I had my fingerprints all over. And in that article, Tillerson and Bolton both confirmed that Trump had been leaning on the SDNY prosecution and that Giuliani had an audience with Donald Trump and Tillerson, and which Giuliani was pushing Tillerson to claim national security priority over the prosecution of the money launderer and later the bank. And Tillerson actually refused to because doing so would have been illegal. With the revelation and anger of what happened on January 6th, I began a deeper research project. So this is, again, January of 2021. I'd made a decision based on what I had seen on January 6th with the initial research that I had that, okay, I need to map out who Lev Parnas and who Rudy Giuliani had met and why. And so after about 6 months of timelining, I found that the duo had met with individuals tied to a broad series of alleged crimes spanning from Turkey to Venezuela to Ukraine to Russia. And all the individuals were deeply connected to the governments. And so what I concluded was that Giuliani had been acting as a shadow secretary of state. And maybe connecting through that would be more like also a mob lawyer for the well-connected. So at the very same time, Giuliani was acting as an unofficial advisor to the president of the United States and later his private lawyer. Giuliani was not paid for either of those jobs, but he was being paid by his clients. So the conclusions that I have in the book have criminal, national security, and geopolitical ramifications, which I delve into in the book. But further, this shadow diplomacy projects and later investigations into them are also the root cause of the attempts to overturn the election itself in 2020.
Have there
So
been any repercussions to you personally for doing this work?
I'd rather not get into the details of that, but let's just say I had a number of fishy things happen while I was investigating this stuff. After the article came out, I had a Turkish investment company seeking to invest into my company that I had at the time, which seemed very odd considering my company was in the country, not in Turkey, and that they would have no knowledge of my company outside of someone telling them. I also had a situation, and this is the last one I'm going to tell you about, that a confidant of mine who had been holding material because of prior weird things happening got a phone call from the former law firm of Rudy Giuliani the day that Rudy Giuliani was raided by the FBI in April of 2021. Kind of scared me a little bit, to say the least.
Yeah, so are you in fear for your life?
I wouldn't say that I'm in fear for my life. I would say I have had to take a number of precautions to protect myself, both where I am, how I live, what I communicate online, trying
Mhm.
to leave no trace of where I am per se. But the information that we're talking about, bluntly speaking, people have died already for it in Turkey and in Ukraine and in Venezuela. And I'm sure that Donald Trump and Rudy Giuliani will be happy to encourage their supporters to push death threats on me down the line. As the book becomes more well known, my risk goes up. So it's a crazy situation where your success is also your risk.
Wow, that's incredible. Giuliani himself is not exactly doing too well these days as a result of all of this, right?
He's not, but he did lose a civil lawsuit to the tune of give or take $148 million, as I recall. But oddly enough, some stranger paid that money off for him. I
Oh,
have a
wow.
I have an inkling of who that may be, but I'm still not sure because when it came to the settlement of the lawsuit, who paid the money to the plaintiffs, i.e., the people that Giuliani defamed in the lead up to the attempts to overturn the election in 2020.
Mhm.
There's no record of who paid them. And I know Giuliani, based on his reported finances, didn't have the money. And
Correct.
the money was somewhere around 148 million. So I can give you one or two guesses of who that may have been. I have no proof of
You want to give me those guesses? I'll take them.
that. I'll give you one guess.
All right.
Go ahead. I'll
Okay.
give you a hint. He's in the White House.
Oh, there's a good hint.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's got,
Uh,
he used to have orange hair, but now it's turning white.
yeah, it seems that way. Or I think he's going for the dirty surfer look from 1970s.
All right.
But
Right.
yeah, the concerns that I have for the material I have in the book are going to be ongoing because to give you an idea of why I'm concerned of threats, I'm concerned of both of threats from Trump supporters in the United States down the line. I'm also concerned with the Turkish government because the Turkish government has forcefully removed Turkish citizens from foreign countries. A lot of them are critics of the Turkish government, and just, I guess now about 10 days ago, a person who claimed that senior leadership of the Turkish government was laundering money through the Turkish mafia in northern Cyprus. That person was assassinated in downtown Amsterdam.
Uh-oh.
Yeah. So before someone says, "Oh, maybe you're getting a little too excited about things like this, concerns
Mhm.
like this," I would point to that and say that just happened a week ago.
Yeah, I wouldn't think that it should be poo-pooed at all.
No, no, it's
Yeah.
just once you come to realization of the ramifications of the material you're working on, you realize that you need to take precautions.
Yeah.
And because I started 4 years ago in the research, and some weird things happened in the initial months of me doing that research, my
Mhm.
security went way up, my precautions went way up. So
Yeah.
today, it's really hard to know where I
Okay.
am or what I'm doing.
Okay. All right. So you've done this investigative work. Do you have a background as a journalist or what?
Background, no, not as a journalist. I have a degree in history and a degree in political science, both out of the University of Maryland. I grew up in the United States, born and raised up until about 19 or so. But after graduating from high school, I saved up money, went backpacking to Europe for 6.5 months, and then
Okay.
came back and went back to university and finished. After university, I spent a year in the Czech Republic teaching English, another year in Spain teaching English, and then 6 years in St. Petersburg, Russia. And my background in my studies, as I had mentioned, was focused on Russia, national security issues, and American foreign policy. So I was well tuned to Russian foreign policy, Russian security interests by the time I left Russia. And that helped me, as I mentioned before, discover Russian disinformation operations at a very, very early stage. So I think collectively, my life experiences is the things that kind of guided me to having a deep knowledge of national security issues, but more focused on Russian national security issues
Okay.
and looking from the lens of Russia towards the United States. Most people would say, what happens in America is Americans' politics, blah, blah, blah. What happens in Russia's politics is what happens in Russia. But because I had spent so many years in Russia, I could look to America from the lens of how Russia looked at America and
Okay.
see how they operated, how they talked about America, and that in fact, for years, even before I saw the beginnings of Russian disinformation, you would see in Russian media increasing pressure by the Russian government to persuade the Russian public that America or the West or gays are their enemy and the enemy of the Russian government, which today it's full blown across all of the spectrum of Russian media that the West is your enemy. They're fascists. And somehow, being fascist, they are also pro gay and have a morally deprived lifestyle, blah, blah, blah. That's what Russia would promote to the public. What I find even more interesting is a lot of that messaging is now in conservative media in the United States as well.
Okay. What's the name of your book?
The Persuasion Game.
There's a subtitle to it, right?
Yeah, it is about I honestly forget it off the top of my head, but it is about those who peddle influence into the United States. The original name of the book, or the original subtitle of the book, was The Persuasion Game: Greed, Corruption, Obstruction, Repeat, which was the cycle that I had seen in Turkey or in Russia or in Venezuela. And now we're seeing that same cycle in the United States.
Where did the title come from, The Persuasion Game?
What the book is really about. And it sounds like it's a psychological book, maybe a self help book of some sort, but actually, at its heart, it's a detective story, a nonfiction detective story where
Okay.
it focuses on adversarial countries, again, using intermediaries to find Washington insiders to persuade the US government to do their bidding. Thus, the title. It's about, frankly, espionage.
Okay. So where can people find your book?
They can find me as an author on my author's page, chadlewis.net. The book you can find on both Amazon and Barnes and Noble. And the hardback, as I said, was just released on April 2nd of this year. And I look forward to pushing it into the mainstream because, frankly, the public needs to know what the government and what the people who worked in their, or who are working for the government did.
Okay. Do you have any closing thoughts for our audience?
Yeah, that if you think that authoritarianism that Trump seems to be promoting across the board is going to just disappear on its own, you have another thing coming to you. Because in my experiences in other countries, it only gets firmer, the grip of the authoritarian. And I think that we're going to see it continue to firm around, quite honestly, the throat of democracy in the United States.
Okay. All right, Chad. This has been Chad Lewis, author of The Persuasion Game, and I appreciate you joining us today on the Lean to Left podcast, Chad. Thank you.
Bob, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Hey guys, I'm Bob Gatty, founder and host of Lean to the Left. I'm excited to share our new book, Hijacked Nation: Donald Trump's Attack on America's Greatness, co-authored with political analyst and professor C.J. Waldron. In Hijacked Nation, we delve into the unfolding story of America's political landscape through a series of essays from leantotheleft.net. We explore how Donald Trump's presidency has transformed American politics, challenging our values and institutions. Hijacked Nation isn't just a book, it's a call to action. It invites you to reflect on what it means to be American in a divided political landscape. Together we can reclaim our nation's greatness. So get your copy of Hijacked Nation today. Visit leantotheleft.net and click on the Books tab to learn more and to order.